All right, now to add more perspective in terms of how this could have happened, was it indeed a human error that could have led to a passenger airliner having been shot down? We're joined by Kaye, who is a former Royal Air Force pilot, who's also an investigative journalist, and he's joining us live from Paris. Mr. Kaye, let me begin by asking you this. This is an apology and an admission by Iran. They've come forward and said that it was a human error that led to this passenger aircraft being shot down. Is this possible?
Well, firstly, good morning. Firstly, I think this is a staggering admission of culpability by Iran so early after the accident occurred. When you go back to the discussions and the investigations on the USS Vincennes, the American frigate shoot down of the Iranian Airbus A300 in 1988, those investigations went on for months, and the Americans, at the end of the day, never admitted culpability officially, but they did pay out a lot of money to the relatives of those that were involved in the accident. So I think what Iran's done is the silver lining in this tragedy. What Iran's done is very encouraging. What I would say, though, is that having investigated this from the very beginning, having investigated MH17, which was the Malaysian airliner shoot down over Ukraine that you referred to, the information that was coming in, the eyewitness accounts, and the way that was being verified through geolocation by certain organizations such as Bellingcat and the New York Times, the evidence was mounting. The jigsaw puzzle was becoming more comprehensive, and the case was building against Iran's refusal to acknowledge that something nefarious had happened. You had the chief of the Iranian Aviation Authority just on Thursday saying that claims that this was a missile shoot down were not accurate and it was a mechanical failure. You had the Iranian government saying that the US and Western leaders were spreading propaganda based on lies. And then you have this reversal. And I think the only thing that has tipped the Iranians to put their hands up and say, or the straw that broke the camel's back, if you'd like, that tipped the Iranians to put their hand up and admit culpability, is what the two black box recorders said. And I think on Friday it was the flight data recorder and it was the cockpit voice recorder that will have probably given enough evidence to the Iranians to say, look, this is something that we're just going to have to admit to. Now, this is the what part of the investigation. I spoke about this with you yesterday. I think there's two parts to this investigation. The first one is what happened. I think we're coming to a limited conclusion on what happened, especially with the admission of culpability by Iran. The next bit is why. And I think questions now have to look at the systems processes by the operating crew of the SA-15 of what happened that day, what alert level they were on, what process they were used in terms of the search radar, in terms of the tracking radar, how the aircraft was identified on that, and what human factors led to potentially the shoot down. So I think that's going to be more prickly. That's going to be harder because obviously that involves military classifications. It will involve what the readiness of the Iranian the IRGC were that night because of the shooting of the ballistic missiles into Iraq. So there will be a lot of factors in terms of classification that might be difficult now to ascertain the level of extent of human factors error that went on.
Absolutely. Now, one of the other things which a lot of people would, of course, be interested in is now Iran claims that this passenger airliner appeared to them like a hostile jet, which is one of the reasons that would have led to it being shot down. As a former Royal Air Force pilot, this is something which people would be interested in. How does a radar pick up anything that is flying up in the sky, and can a radar tell the difference between a passenger airliner from a missile, a drone, or an enemy fighter jet?
Yeah, it 100% can. I mean, and this is a good question to ask. My previous job in the military was actually a weapons instructor, so I used to teach senior pilots how to evade these type of missile systems, both shoulder launched and radar guided. So this is a good question. It's all based on the transponder. And the transponder is an electronic box inside the cockpit of the aircraft, and it has 4 numbers on it. And what air traffic control does is air traffic control gives the crew a specific number to that aircraft. In the case of Flight 752, the number was 5510, and that information is available on the flight data trackers like Flight 24 radar. So that number 5510, the crew will input into the transponder. Secondary surveillance radar is the radar that is designed to pick up those numbers. And that number, 5510, will appear on every search radar screen. With it will probably be attributed what's called a mode Charlie, and that will give the altitude. So on a radar screen, you will see a specific number, 5510, and you'll see the altitude of the aircraft. And any search and radar operator, whether they're military or civilian, will be able to identify whether that is or identify that that is civilian air traffic. Now, the other thing here is that the aircraft was off the extended centerline of Iranian International Airport, which means that aircraft will be flying past that particular SAM site on a very, very frequent basis with very, very well-known what's called squawks. The squawks are the number, that 5510 number. That's what it's referred to by air traffic control. Flight 752, please squawk 5510, and then the crew will put that on. So aircraft will have been passing that surface-to-air missile site on a very, very frequent basis. The big question that I've got now, and the big question that I would have to Iranian authorities, is why that particular aircraft was targeted, either accidentally or not. If it was an accidental situation, which is what we're sort of assuming here, because there doesn't seem to be any motive for Iran to shoot down an aircraft that had a majority of Iranian civilians on, let alone no U.S. citizens. So I'm struggling with the motive and why it might be deliberate. So going with the idea that it was accidental, and given the frequency of aircraft that will pass relatively close to that surface-to-air missile site, that would be a big question for me. The other big question, of course, is that literally the surface-to-air missile sites on the high readiness states that they would have been on, because the ballistic missiles are just fired into Iraq. The other question is that what were the deconfliction procedures for civilian air traffic to be allowed to fly in an airspace region that had just launched ballistic missiles? There would be big questions as to why air traffic wasn't deconflicted more on that particular basis, or why, even if aircraft were allowed to fly, given the other aerial activity that was going on. So they're the questions that I'd be asking. But I hope that answers your question in terms of how you identify a civilian aircraft on a search radar.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, that actually brings me to the next question that I want to ask you. Now, considering the fact that it was just a few hours prior to this aircraft being shot down that Iran had fired missiles into Iraq, considering the heightened hostilities that were prevalent at that point of time, could it not have been possible that civilian aircrafts could have been told not to fly, at least for some point of time?
That will be a big question that I think the investigating authority will ask. Indeed, it's all about, in the military, we used to call it battle space management. And Iranian's airspace will have been turned into battle space because of the heightened tensions and because of the activities that you just alluded to, namely the firing of Iranian ballistic missiles on 2 U.S. bases in Iraq. So with that, as a military man, I used to also be in charge of battle space deconfliction. The questions will be asked: what was the battle space deconfliction for the intended military activity that night? And it's not just about the missiles that were fired from Iran into Iraq. It will have been about where are the, it's called IADS, the Integrated Air Defense System. Where are the radar sites? Where are the missile sites? Where are the airfields that have the fighter jets that Iran have that are air defense jets, so the jets that are on standby, a very high readiness standby to get airborne and potentially counter an aggressive airborne threat, for example. So all of these factors that will go into a strategic and a tactical military campaign that is aggressing, but also then expecting a response and have to have a defense posture. All of those plans should have been deconflicted in some way with the civilian air traffic movements that were happening over the period that military activities was taking place. And I think that's another big question as well that the investigation should be asking. And indeed, based on what those military tactical plans were by Iran, what were the procedures then to deconflict the civilian air traffic with those? That's the huge question.
Absolutely, indeed. And one of the other things that, a lot of people would be wondering about, and something that the American president himself would have in mind, is how advanced and complex is this Iranian surface-to-air missile defense system? Because remember, just last year, the Iranians had also shot down an American drone. And now they've done this accidentally, but they've shot down a passenger plane. So how advanced do you think is the Iranian surface-to-air missile defense system?
Yeah, the SA-15 Gauntlet is an advanced system. It's got an advanced search radar, it's got an advanced tracking radar, and it uses the missile, which has a proximity fuse, which explodes near the aircraft, doesn't actually explode on contact with the aircraft, to cause the damage. It's a double salvo release, which means it releases two at a time. So yeah, pretty advanced sort of system, pretty deadly. And again, this goes back to what the operators were doing. It's a four-man crew that operates the track system. You've got one driver, and then you've got three operators, and the operators will work very closely together through a process to search for the potential target on the search radar, the handover to the tracking radar, and then the launch. So it is an advanced system. It's a deadly system. I don't know how much training that the Iranians have on it. I don't know how much the Iranian operator crews have operated it under training circumstances or under circumstances for real. Again, there'll be questions that come out. You'll have to look at who the crew is, who the three-person composition was, what their experience was, what their training was, if there are any affiliations on the nefarious side, if there are any personal vendettas from one of the crew. And all of these questions will have to surface. But it is slightly different in some way to the MH17 shoot down in terms of that was a Buck missile system that the rebel-backed Russian forces inside eastern Ukraine had got their hands on. And again, that is a completely different investigation in itself, because Russia was obviously denying any contact with Russian-backed separatists, and that's the way it's creating its destabilization in Ukraine. So again, it's nuanced. It's a slightly different situation here, because you actually have a military crew from the Islamic Republican Guard Corps who have, by what it seems, committed this action. So I think the relationship between Iran's hierarchy and the IRGC, and how much pressure that the Iranian investigators can put on the IRGC in order to come out with the truth on how this actually happened from inside the weapon system itself, I think will be potentially very prickly.
Absolutely, indeed. And just before I let you go, Mr. Kaye, now that Iran has conceded to the fact that it did indeed, inadvertently and in error shoot down this passenger airliner, fixing culpability, how will this now proceed? What will be the future course of the investigation?
I still think there's some way to go in terms of an official report that outlines what happened. There's been some brilliant investigations going on by public investigation companies like Bellingcat that are using open source information to try and ascertain what happened. There's some good investigators plugging into that. The New York Times are doing a good job. So I think sort of from journalistic investigative accounts, there's a sort of a fairly good outline of what happened, but that's going to have to be corroborated and agreed to by the official investigating authorities. I think the NTSB, which is the American Air Accident Investigation Board, working with Boeing, working with Iran, working with representatives from the Ukraine, I think they will have to have some form of military input now to be able to write the report. Military input based on the activity of that particular SA-15 and where it was, in order to inform exactly what happened. Moving forward from that, I then think you get into this sort of delicate investigation of why it happened, and you start looking at the what happened with inside the missile system at the time, and as I said before, with the operator's background. So I think that's going to take much longer to get to the bottom of, and indeed we may not get to the bottom of that. I think the next thing as well is then what Iran's response is from here. So the foreign minister Jari Sharif has come on Twitter and apologized for it, but at the same time he's sort of blamed the Americans for the quote unquote adventurism. So I think it remains to be seen as to what level of response politically Iran will now take in terms of, will they compensate the families on board like the Americans did for the USS Vincennes? Will they go that far? But I do think politically the Iranians will use this as maybe a moment to sort of indicate that they are a truthful organization. They will sort of, they will use this to sort of say, look, we put our hands up. We were very transparent about this, this shoot down, and maybe use that going forward to persuade particularly Western leaders outside of America that they have certain intentions when it comes to the JCPOA, for example, which is the nuclear agreement. So I feel like this may be a foundation that the Iranians can work on to try and gain a little bit of trust with Western leaders, a silver lining in a very, very sad tragedy, obviously. But I feel like that may be where the Iranians politically try and take this.
Absolutely, indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Kaye, for joining us and putting all of this into perspective and also giving us the insights as to how all of this works. And this, of course, will be a story that we...